All right. Good evening. I would like to. My name is Suad Abdul Kabir, and on behalf of Sapelo Square, an online resource on Black Muslims in the United States, I'd like to welcome our panelists tonight and our viewing audience with the universal greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum. Tonight we are gathered to have a discussion, sort of a part two. Where do we go from here? Action steps. This conversation is a follow-up to our online conversation we had last year, right after the November elections. Last time in our conversation, we gathered 5 Black Muslim leaders to talk about or evaluate the political landscape under the new administration. Tonight, we are looking to identify current action steps that Black Muslims are taking and to show models of what we can and should be doing. Hence, in the illustrious words of Redman, it's time for some action. Some of the subjects we will include tonight, we will cover tonight include interfaith solidarity, direct political engagement, women's organizing, the Muslim ban, and how to use social media to effectively promote our own messages. And so the format of tonight will be the following. We'll begin, I'll read through the bios of each of our speakers tonight. Then I will ask sort of each speaker a specific question that we'll respond to. And then we'll move on to sort of a broader conversation, which will include question and answer from the viewing audience. So if you have a question, you should definitely either tweet us at Sapelo Square or use the Facebook page for the Facebook event page for tonight's talk to send your questions. And then finally, we'll close with some closing remarks by each speaker and then action steps, specific things that you can do today, sort of right after the conversation is over, to really sort of to do the kind of action that needs to be done. And of course, we always begin in the name of Allah, and we ask for blessings to be upon the Prophet Muhammad, his family, and all righteous people until the end of time. So we have a really great panel of folks today. Our first panelist is Imam Johari Abdul Malik. He is a director of outreach at the Dar al-Hijra Islamic Center and former Muslim chaplain at Howard University. And he was the first Muslim officially installed as a chaplain in higher education at HU and is the head of the National Association of Muslim Chaplains in Higher Education. Imam Johari also serves as a chair of government relations for the Muslim Alliance in North America, and he is the director of community outreach for the Dar al-Hijra Islamic Center and president of the Muslim Society of Washington, Incorporated. Our second, so that's it. Our next speaker for the evening is Jihad Saleh. Jihad Saleh Williams is the government and public affairs manager for Islamic Relief USA, the nation's largest Muslim humanitarian and advocacy organization based in Alexandria, Virginia. Jihad coordinates Islamic Relief USA's advocacy and engagement with congressional offices, executive departments, and embassies. His advocacy focuses on humanitarian issues such as ending hunger in the U.S. abroad, poverty alleviation, gender-based violence, and the congressional budget and appropriations. As part of his advocacy work, Jihad is the co-chair of the Interfaith Coalition for Domestic Human Needs and is a member of the Alliance to End Hunger's Advocacy Committee. Previously, Jihad worked in the U.S. House of Representatives as a legislative assistant focused on education and anti-poverty policies. Our next speaker for the evening will be Sister Aisha Prime. She is the executive director of Baraka Incorporated, a nonprofit using Islamic education to solve social ills. She has spent her life as an educator, artist, activist, and entrepreneur committed to the goal of empowering Muslim women to rise above their challenges to maximize their full potential. After having participated in several circles of knowledge in the US, Aisha decided to pursue religious studies abroad. She studied Arabic and Quran at the Fajr Institute and General Islamic Studies in other institutes in Cairo, Egypt. After Egypt, she moved to Hadramaut, Yemen, and enrolled in Dar Zahra, an Islamic university for women. There she studied Aqidah, Quran, Hadith, Arabic, jurisprudence, Islamic law, purification of the heart, and other religious learning. Our next speaker this evening is Nisreen Al-Amin. Nisreen is a doctoral candidate at the Stanford University. Her research interests focus broadly on the ways in which globalization and development practices have shaped struggles over land in East Africa. Her primary interest lies in exploring the political economy of foreign land acquisition in Sudan, South Sudan, and Tanzania, and the legal and sociocultural history of land reform in the region. Nisreen is originally from Sudan and received her BA in Sociopolitical Development Studies from Harvard and an MA in Comparative International Education from the Teachers College of New York City. And finally, our last but not least speaker of the evening is Sister Jamia Adams. Jamia has produced educational, advocacy, and documentary media for the internet, television, radio, and film. Hailing from the San Francisco Bay Area, Jamia marched in and led communications for the digital media for the NAACP Journey for Justice, Ferguson to Jefferson City Trek on behalf of Mike Brown in 2014, and later a 1,000-mile civil rights march in 2015. Last year, she was appointed to the Mary McLeod Bethune Council House National Historic Site Advisory Commission and was designated as an Empower 100 social justice leader. Currently, she works for MoveOn.org and volunteers for Masjid Muhammad, the Women's March, and the American Muslim Health Professionals. So thank you. We have a great, illustrious panel tonight, so I'm really looking forward to that. Sister Aisha is coming. I think she's had some technical difficulties, so if you don't see her little box now, she will be here, indeed. So let me start with you, Imam Jahari. So there's been a lot of conversation. I think I've seen some of this in social media and some of different articles about this idea that Black Muslims have lost their connection with our own, and I think people here are citing Dr. Sherman Jackson, this idea of a Bani Hashim, sort of the broader Black community. So what do you think about that? Like, what is the connection? Have we lost this connection to the broader Black community, and what can we do to strengthen this relationship?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Beginning by praising Allah and thanking Allah for having guided us to this way of life, in a way to reconnect us with those divine principles that human beings were created to follow, that they might be successful in this life and in the hereafter. I think when we talk about this concept going back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and looking at his relationship with his people. So when we talk about the idea of Bani Hashim, we're talking about that relationship that is a kinship relationship, that then the phenomenon of faith is introduced. And we have always, through waves of discussions, had this presentation that faith trumps race. Therefore, whenever one is talking about the issue of my people, my qawmi, the Prophet ﷺ says, when he's introducing himself as a prophet, he says, "Oh, my people." He's talking to his Bani Hashim. Would you believe me if I told you that I'm a prophet? It is at that point where you start to see some separation. Are you still my people because I've accepted a different way of life, a better way of life? I'm improving myself, I'm improving you. But I want to take you back for a minute, because we don't have long, but to bring you a sense of Islam in the American context, that I remember in the late 60s, to be Black, to be Pan-Africanist, to be progressive, people would say, you must be Muslim. If you're a vegetarian, people would say, oh, you're a vegetarian, you must be Muslim, right? And there was this integration between the Black struggle and the Muslim struggle. And then something happened. First, I don't want us to lose sight of the history. COINTELPRO was an important part of separating that Black African Islamic thing. And so there are many people who were driven away from community activism as Muslims because they knew the consequences of that meant that the government would come after you. Elements of the government, not the whole government. Jay, I know you work with the government.
Thank you.
So not all the government, but parts of the some renegades in the government in COINTELPRO. But then we had the phenomenon that I call the Asian invasion, where you have waves of IT professionals coming, being recruited by the State Department, coming with IT skills, to help to develop America's internet infrastructure. And they bring with them a baggage and an understanding of what Islam is in their home country, and begin to say to Black people that the way you practice Islam is not correct. And in the wake of Elijah Muhammad, and in the early days of Waziruddin Muhammad, there was not the consistency of leadership to be able to say, no, we know what we're doing. We've been practicing Islam, but we were here before Columbus practicing Islam. Then to attack again the rudiments of this, then you have what I call the Salafi invasion, where you have sheikhs from Saudi and other places saying, no, this is the proper way to practice Islam. And if you get involved with Black things, that's asabiyah, that's nationalism, and you shouldn't be involved in that. And there were many people who were disaffected by this. They wouldn't go to the funeral of their relative who was a Christian, even though we have example of the Prophet ﷺ honoring people who weren't even Ahlul Kitab, but they were deceased. So we begin to have this disintegration between the Black community and the Black Muslim community. And in order for you to demonstrate that you're really Muslim, you have to demonstrate that you're really not Black. At the root of the Black experience in Islam in the late 60s, early 70s, into the 80s was freedom, justice, and equality, right? That Islam was considered by many people not just a religion, but a social justice movement. It had a social justice imperative. And when we got separated from that with our orthodoxy and our proper aqidah, we wound up moving further and further away until the only organization among Muslims that was relevant was the Nation of Islam as it came to social justice issues. So with that, I'm gonna close, but it really shows for me that connection between the Pan-Africanist ideas, the Islamic ideas coming out of Africa, and the Black American experience that somehow or other got decoupled in our attempt to become more authentically Muslim.
Thank you for that. And we're definitely loop back around to this question as well. But that also is a nice segue actually to the next, to Nasreen, because I wanted to ask her a question next. And so Ibn Johari is talking about this connection, Pan-Africanism and sort of COINTELPRO, the government's role, right? So the role of the government in sort of affecting Black communities, Black Muslim communities, but also this notion of Black Muslim communities see themselves, are broader than just US based, right? And so I wanted to ask you if you could speak a little bit about your own experience, specifically with one of the most recent executive orders, the Muslim ban, right? Because you had a personal experience with that. And I wonder if you could speak about your personal experience with that and also how that reflects, right, the kind of challenges that Black Muslims who are immigrants face at this time. You're still muted. You're muted.
Can you hear me now? So first of all, I want to say thank you for allowing me to be part of this conversation. I have lived in the US for 24 years. I became a permanent resident 5 years ago, and exactly 1 month ago, I was one of hundreds of people who were detained trying to enter the US around the same time that the Muslim ban was implemented. I was doing dissertation research in Sudan, and I heard about leaked drafts of the order. And after having conversations with my university and family, decided to get on the next flight back. I was trying to get in before the order came into effect, but I ended up missing a connecting flight and got into JFK on a Friday evening about 20 minutes after immigration officials were told about the order. And I was detained for several hours along with other Iranian and Iraqi citizens who had green cards and valid visas. We were questioned extensively about our lives and our families. The officer told me he knew nothing about Sudan and asked if I could talk about the political situation. I was asked if I knew radical groups in Sudan, if I knew people with radical views. Other people who were detained with me were asked if they knew people who wanted to harm the US. It was quite chaotic because the officers really didn't get much direction from Washington, and it was late at night. And after a few hours, we were body searched in quite an uncomfortable way, and like my, chest and groin area by female officers. I was also handcuffed briefly, and we were then transferred to a 24-hour holding area before being released around 3 a.m. And the officer who was handling my case at the end said I was free to go because green card holders were being dealt with on a case-by-case basis, and that nothing, quote, derogatory had been found in the system against me. But many people were not as lucky as I was, and they were deported. And in the process, people were separated from their families, from their children. And one of the things that struck me during my detention was how the outcomes of our detentions were quite arbitrary, and how that arbitrariness meant that some people were being sent back to places where they might face torture or death. And in our cases, it was up to the immigration officer in charge to determine, because the language of the order and it sort of empowers to interpret and abuse their power. It's important, I think, to remember that there are 3 African countries on the list. And from what myself and others experienced, I know that anti-Blackness and the way officers are trained to racially profile shapes how these immigration executive orders are getting enforced, and how Black Muslims in particular are experiencing the impact of these policies. And also, like, what happened to me is not representative of the kinds of ordeals that people went through. I think I was partly shielded because of my affiliation with Stanford. Like, I think of a Sudanese man in his late 70s who was detained for 30 hours, I heard, without being given any food. There was a Somali woman with her family who was handcuffed even while she was going to the bathroom. And there's an organization called the Black Alliance for Just Immigration that's doing some really great work. They reported that although Black immigrants make up only 7% of the US immigrant population, they comprise 21% of those facing deportation as a result of contact with the criminal justice system. So I think it's important to recognize that many Black immigrants are undocumented, including citizens of these 3 African countries that are targeted by the Muslim ban. So, I know people, so people in the Somali and Sudanese and Libyan community are now being put at risk and are targeted by the Muslim ban and by the other executive order that was signed 2 days before that, that targets and criminalizes undocumented people. So, for instance, I know people who are undocumented who drive with an international driver's license, right? And that, shows your citizenship. So they get pulled over by the police all the time because, they're driving while Black, and they get charged with unlicensed driving, and then they get caught up in the court system, and they're then put at risk for deportation for something as mundane as driving to work. So I think it's important that we talk about these 2 immigration orders as interlinked in terms of how they're affecting our communities, and that our organizing be focused on resisting really both of these orders. So, like, sometimes in the ways nonprofits channel and target undocumented communities with services or know your rights workshops, I think Black people often get marginalized because they aren't seen as part of these communities. So something as simple as like things being translated into Spanish, but not into French or Creole or Arabic. So the other thing I was thinking about while I was detained, I watched one of the people detained cry out of fear and frustration that he wasn't going to be able to see his wife and child who were waiting for him in the waiting hall. And he had waited several years to get his visa to be reunited with him. And it made me think about how these detentions and deportations and the ICE raids that are happening across the country are making people feel like deeply unsafe. And me was about some hate mail today, in the mail, that sort of says to me is a sort of similar sentiment around like, this is necessary to keep our country safe. And I'm, in my head, I'm thinking like, safe for who? I think that's a question we all have to ask ourselves, like who does and doesn't have the right to feel safe and secure? And the Muslim communities targeted by this list are countries where people are dealing with the consequences of US military intervention and sanctions for decades now. And so I ask myself, do those people have a right to feel secure? I've been hearing of Somali and Ghanaian refugees who built a life in the US and they're now walking for miles from the US to the Canadian border in sub-zero temperatures getting frostbite and risking their lives because they don't feel safe. And, again, I ask myself, do they have a right to feel safe in the communities they help build and sustain? And the same, like this was the 5th year anniversary of Trayvon Martin's death recently. So we have to ask ourselves, do Black people have the right to feel safe and protected by the law in their interactions with law enforcement? So I think there's a hypocrisy in terms of like the selective conversation we're having around, who is and isn't, allowed to feel safe.
Yeah. No, thank you for that, Nistine. And I think we'll come back around to that. I think that's a nice way to also segue back to sort of jihad, because sort of jihad, sort of your work, both with Islamic Relief, but also your work with sort of with Congress and sort of politics and sort of thinking about. So we have kind of a history of COINTELPRO, right, and ways in which the government surveilled Muslims. Then we have this contemporary moment in which Muslims are being subjected to something like the Muslim ban, right? But then, as Serena is noting, we also have this reality of other sort of even the other executive order on policing, for example, right? And then other issues, healthcare, education, right? Like all of these sort of multiple issues that are sort of kind of rolling out one by one. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about those kind of challenges and what we could be doing to respond.
Thank you, Sister Sawad. I would ask actually just real quickly, all participants mute their microphones. There's a lot of feedback I'm hearing right now. Okay. Thank you. So, thank you for the question. I want, hopefully we'll be able to frame now the understanding of really what's happening here in DC with President Trump's administration and the new 115th Congress led by Republicans, and particularly how it impacts our community, African American Muslim. I always have to start off as saying that when we speak largely, when we hear the public discourse about Muslim Americans, whether it's coming from government officials, from the White House, particularly from the media, Muslim Americans are largely framed, only spoken about, or even given the opportunity to speak about themselves in the frames of, I think we can all name them: terrorism, counterterrorism, maybe, it's the old, okay, you're not a terrorist, but you probably know a terrorist, so help us catch a terrorist. The discussion, another one being, international affairs. Well, all Muslims are foreigners, all immigrants, and so you probably actually care more about what's going on in Pakistan or Saudi Arabia, so help us understand that, because you have probably very little value to speak about what do Americans, kitchen table issues that are impacting Americans. And then 3, the culture wars or the gender issues, why do Muslims beat their women and so forth. I want to first say that these issues are important issues. These are issues that we may have insight from a professional level, from a network level, that we should be engaging on. But to only allow the Muslim American community, particularly in its diversity, for us to not step forward and forcefully speak about how we as Muslim Americans, from our ethics, our value systems, as from our historical experiences, particularly as African Americans, and long-term Arab and South Asian communities that have been here, some of them for almost 100 years, have responded to such the types of issues of poverty, homelessness, hunger, so forth in their communities. It's really, I would say, particularly on an organizational, institutional level, representative Muslim organizations not to engage on these issues is actually derelict of responsibility. But that's my critique, first and foremost. But when it comes down to it, let me give you a little bit, one data point that came out a couple of years ago that will also help you frame from the Pew research about Muslim Americans. 40% of Muslim Americans live at or below poverty in the United States. And this quite often counters a narrative that we consistently hear in the media that the Muslim American community is one of the highest income earning communities, highly educated communities in America. No doubt there are highly educated, very well-off communities, but the Muslim community is not monolithic. And I also want to be very clear, it's not all Black Muslims, because even some Muslims think when we talk about poverty, we only talk about Black folks. First and foremost, there's poverty across all sections of our racial and ethnic differences: Arab Americans, South Asians, and Arab and Muslim African Americans, and so forth. So if we keep that data point in mind, it creates a situation where we have to speak about the issues of poverty, homelessness, hunger, and so forth on our communities. Otherwise, we are basically have a unfortunate improper order of the most pressing issues. And I think this is what we consistently see, again, out of our own organizations quite often, is how we're responding to what flying while Muslim, being profiled at the airport and so forth. Again, these issues are important, and if they happen, we should respond to them. You know, a provocateur being sent into a mosque by FBI. Again, if this is true, if we find out about it, we should respond. But I would say on an existential level, many Muslim Americans, this is not the primary concern when they're sitting at home wondering about how they're going to feed their child the next day, or concerned about if there is a provocateur in their mosque. So how do we go about thinking about how Muslim Americans respond, and then with the reality of this new Congress and how people like President Trump, with his new budget, this discussion is very fortuitous because of, we just heard 2 days ago, President Trump putting forth his budget proposal, his presentation last night at his first address to Congress, and then also what are the priorities of this 115th Congress. So quickly, we've all heard very much President Trump has led for the first 40 days, not through legislation, but through executive orders. Orders such as the Muslim and the refugee travel ban. Very much do impact our communities. Again, we should be concerned about it, how to respond, because these do betray the American values of being a place of refuge for those in need. Our issue of how has America been a place of also for prosperity, has grown and developed and benefited from our immigrant communities. But again, the real putting down the hammer is what he said 2 days ago with his budget, thinking about how this president's proposing a $54 billion cut in many social service programs that impact our communities. To do what? To supposedly build up our depleted military. 2, to build a wall. 3, to increase law and order by increasing law enforcement. Because of all the crime-ridden neighborhoods that the Black community, we're just so bad, such a bad condition, right? But I would say again, if we look at these type of programs, social service programs such as Head Start under threat, job training programs, affordable housing subsidies, these very much impact our communities. Those Muslims, be African American, South Asian, Arab, so forth, who live at poverty or below 40%. Again, these are programs that help communities get a leg up in life, create opportunity. And also we talked about his tax break, which very much will benefit rich communities, further perpetuate rich communities. And I would say this last, and I'll speak a bit later on about how we can respond, but we need to remember, there is a lot of focus on President Trump, but we must always remember back to your 101 civics class back in high school for many people, who actually controls the purse, who actually establishes the budget. It is Congress. And how do we focus on Congress and what are their objectives and how they mesh with President Trump? And then start understanding again, rolling back of Obamacare, rolling back on Medicaid. Medicaid, rolling back on programs like SNAP, or formerly known as food stamps, creating caps on these programs so there's only a limited amount of resources for them in times of need. So how does the Muslim American community say, first and foremost, as a community of justice, respond to the needs of our 40 neighbors to our right and left, and particularly in our own community of poverty, hunger and homelessness? How are we pushing back and demanding, saying that we want a better America, but not built upon the backs of poor people and working class?
Right. No, thank you, Jihad. And that's actually a great way to kind of move to Sister Aisha, because, when all of the things Jihad is talking about in terms of, sort of affordable housing and education and all these things, at the intersection of race and religion and also gender, right? And so women are always sort of particularly sort of more vulnerable in many ways to these very sort of concerns and these questions. And now so you participated in this recently in the Women's March. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about why you were part of the Women's March, what sort of drove you, right, to sort of participate in that, and what do you think is the role of women specifically in sort of the kind of resistance that people are trying to marshal right now? You unmute yourself. let's see. On the screen, see, there's an icon that looks like a microphone. Let's see. Oh, she got the camera. Let's give her a second to see if we can get her back. All right, so let's see. I'm sure she's coming back. So I think in the meantime, let's do this. While we're getting her back, we'll move on to Sister Jamia, and then we'll come back to Aisha. And so I think you're here today, right, to kind of talk to us about sort of social media and amplifying our stories and our messages and using these things strategically and powerfully, right, to sort of really push our own agenda. So maybe you can sort of begin to speak on that.
Sure. So thank you so much for having me on the Google Hangout tonight, and for joining this esteemed panel. It's just, I'm very humbled. I come from the communications, social media background, doing social media, digital media, and communications for several nonprofit organizations, advocacy organizations. I think in the light of this new political era, and I say new in the sense that as Black people, as people of color, we've always been under duress in this country. We've always been fighting for our lives, fighting for social justice, fighting for our civil and human rights. But this is a new political era in the sense that we know directly that a lot of the policies that are coming out of the new administration.
Okay.
I'm going to stop right here and let Aisha
speak. Can you hear me now?
You're good. Go for it. Yeah.
I hope I'm good. It's interesting the challenges I've had tonight because I could and sometimes not hear you. But again, thank you so much for having me on this call tonight, and thank you for being patient with me through the technical challenges. So you asked a question about participating in the Women's March, and I think what's very, very key about all of it is as you said, in participating in the Women's March, what it says is it's extremely important that I, as a Muslim woman, I, as a Black American Muslim woman, and I, as a woman, period, make sure that my particular voice or the community that I represent is heard. Because many times women are put in a position where other people speak for them. And they are not, particularly as it relates to African American Muslim women, as Brother Jihad talked about. A lot of times we're looking at immigrant Muslims, we're looking for Arabs, Pakistanis, and so forth and so forth. And we don't look, in America hasn't looked a lot to the indigenous Muslim community as being able to represent themselves, and particularly Muslim women. And we're most vulnerable in many cases. Number one, because we're the most visible, because many of us do wear hijab. It's quite obvious that we are practitioners of Islam. But even more so when we look at, for example, our interaction in this society, as we sit in the crux of those three, in the intersection of those identities, being Black, being Muslim, and being female. So the reason why it was important to me to speak at the march was to say, number one, I, as an African American Muslim woman, have been here, right? And historically have been here. And when you talk about the economy, that affects me as a woman, it affects me as a Muslim. When you talk about, when Trump, a portion of the march was about an anti-Trump rally. And when you talk about grabbing women by their genitalia, I am directly affected as a woman, especially when we begin, because the president plays a lot, whoever sits in that seat plays a lot into the culture of America. And we begin to see that with some of the hate crimes that have increased since President Trump became sat in this seat. And so even with that context, we've seen it in terms of racism, which affects me directly, but especially as it relates to being a woman, because our bodies are very vulnerable to the culture that happens in America, and our bodies are very vulnerable to the policies that occur. So that relates, as it relates to, of course, housing, healthcare, the way we're treated on the street, the way we're viewed. And so for me, in participating, it was important that I didn't sit back and allow any other agenda to speak for me, but to say that I, as a Muslim woman, it is my God-given right to stand up for myself. It is my God-given responsibility to address the issues that directly affect me, that affect our children, that affect education of our children and even of ourselves. So as a Muslim, we're always reminded to enjoin the good and to forbid the evil, and that's actually what makes us to be from amongst the best of nations. So unless and until we're doing that, we're just kind of taking a backseat role and allowing somebody else to tell our story. And for me, that's just not acceptable.
Thank you. So you need to mute yourself.
Right. Let's try that again. Because we're having multiple.
Yes. Fantastic. Okay, Jamia, Sister Jamia, please come back.
Sure. Thank you so much. And thank you, Sister Aisha. I just was going on and talking about messaging. Messaging is so important. And when we talk about messaging, we're in this new political climate. And as I was saying before, we have been under duress before Trump. We will be under duress after Trump as a community. But it would behoove us to not use the language of our oppressors when we're on social media, when we're speaking about some of the policies that are affecting our communities. There's a lot of language changing that is happening with this new administration, and it's important to be aware of it. The sister earlier spoke about the fact that, there's an interlink between the wall and the fight of our brothers and sisters who are fighting to stay in this country, as well as those who are being pushed out and not being let into this country with the Muslim ban. And it's important that we don't use language like illegal alien or illegal immigrants. There's no such thing as any human being illegal. It's important that we remain using progressive language like undocumented persons. And when we're talking about if we are talking about countering violent extremism, which can be both domestic as well as international and come from every walk of life, every race, and every religion of people, it's important that we are not bringing in the language that this new administration is using. And so I hearken to that language, and I also want to encourage people to give actions too. It's important to be a broadcaster and let folks know about stories. I saw the sister's story on Democracy Now! About being upheld, and as a Stanford University PhD student, I pushed it out on my social media because it's important to say, but it's also important for us to educate each other and to give tangible, actionable items to do in this environment so that we don't feel frustrated and we don't feel disempowered, that we empower our communities and each other with actionable items to do. So that's, just the first piece that I'll add to the conversation.
Thank you. So kind of looping back around a little bit, there are lots of things we touched on. And so I wanted to kind of get us in a broader conversation, then we'll take some questions from the audience. But there are a couple of things, I'll kind of throw them out there and people can sort of respond. So one was and for Imam Johari, you sort of gave us this kind of history of how this kind of relationship between sort of Black Muslims and broader Black communities is sort of frayed. And so the question now is thinking what Sister Jamia was saying in terms of actions, right? So now what can we do? Like, so what are the steps? What are the kinds of things we could be doing to sort of strengthen those relations or rebuild, maybe, if that's the better way to kind of talk about it?
Well, part of what I think is happening now, in every crisis, there's an opportunity. And that in this particular crisis, it gives us a chance to get out of our malaise because the stakes are so high. But part of the issue, as far as I see it, is let us go back into the value system of Muslims. It says, if I see something in the community that's not right, the Prophet ﷺ equated it to our relationship with Allah. That we can't be believers and stand by and see our neighbor go to bed hungry. We can't be a believer and we see that our neighbor who's an immigrant, whatever. In fact, most of the time when you get rounded up, they don't know what your immigration status is. You've been profiled, and that's how you wind up getting caught up. So for us now, the question is putting that faith into action. The Quran says at least 24 times, Inna ladina amanu wa amilu salihat. If you have a relationship with Allah, with God, out of it should naturally flow deeds of righteousness, of justice. And so if you're not involved in the establishment of justice in a society, something is wrong with your relationship with God, with Allah. And Allah is going to hold you accountable. And the fallacy today is that, well, what I do doesn't matter. The reality is when you look at the history of all of the prophets, all of the leaders, it just takes one person to say, I'm going to stand up for what's right, and I don't care who doesn't like it, and Allah is with that person. And that's how we establish justice.
Thank you. No, that's great. I think that I know this kind of thing, it reminds me of this, some quote, maybe it's Margaret Mead, right? Sort of, or someone said this, right? The only thing that's ever changed, don't think a small group of people can't change, right? Sort of the world, that's the only thing that's ever actually happened. And so I appreciate that kind of connection to sort of also sort of religious tradition and history, right? That we can be, we often are looking for, we want to have like 100,000 people come out and do X, Y, or Z. And if they don't come, then we can't do anything. But the idea is that we can, as individuals and small groups, also make changes, which also kind of brings you back again to Sister Nasreen and this question of, I remember getting you mentioned this thing about organizing and the marginalization of Black immigrants in particular. And I remember getting a kind of a email, right, from a group, again, about immigrants. And it was supposed to be pro-Muslim, right? And so it was an email, and it had a picture of a woman who had on a headscarf, and she clearly was supposed to be Arab, right? And I thought to myself, well, that's cool, right? But those are not the only sort of Muslims, right, who matter in terms of these issues, right? And then I saw another sort of kind of image where someone had a similar woman, sort of same headscarf style, but she was Black, right? And so I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about this kind of the ways in which kind of the Black immigrants, right, or sort of gets marginalized in the organizing and these connections. And then what do you think, how should we respond to that? Like, what are some ways you think that we can sort of intervene in that, sort of to try to stop the ways in which those particular people who kind of suffer this double burden, right, sort of kind of like war on terror and war on drugs type of thing, right? So how can we respond to that? You're muted again. You're muted.
About that. So thank you. Yeah, I also want to fold in sort of something that Sister Jamila said about how I think we have to also resist that kind of exceptional narrative of like, it's been mostly, doctors and PhD students whose stories have been picked up. And so there's this idea of like, somehow our labor is more valuable than that of like other people. And most of the Sudanese and Somali communities in this country, yes, there are doctors, yes, there are PhD students, but many of us, many people are working class folks who don't have as much access, especially to the resources like the legal and advocacy resources that say someone like me does. And so one of the things I've been seeing in my community a lot is that people are relying on rumors a lot, that they don't have much access to concrete information, access to pro bono lawyers, that kind of thing. So I think what's happening actually is that, yes, it's important to support groups like the ACLU. They've gotten, obviously, raised a lot of money. But I think, it's organizations like the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, like African Communities Together. I'm speaking specifically about groups in New York City that are community-based, that are led by Black immigrants, that are now really stretched thin because of the demands on them, that we really need to support at this time. Because part of their work is to kind of make visible the Black immigrant experience in these times, and they always have been working on this for decades. So I think that's something to kind of counter the anxiety and fear in our communities. And then I think there's also a lot of work that we as Black Muslim immigrants have to do in our in terms of like, we have a lot of internalized racism in our own community that we have to address and talk about. We can't expect other Black folks to stand in solidarity with us and support us if we, aren't there for them. So I think that's a conversation that, is long overdue and really needs to happen.
Thanks for that. I'm looking at our time. So we have some time to have some more conversation, but I'm still watching our time too. Actually, so I think I want to go back to jihad and then to Jamia. But in terms of jihad, so you said you were going to tell us about countering. So you kind of laid out, right, sort of what are the specific things. And you mentioned this point about Congress. And the idea is that is Congress really a way, is that the way forward? Because I'm sure, I know I'm skeptical. How do we engage kind of the branches of government, right, at this point to really make a dent, in sort of kind of the onslaught?
Okay. Well, thank you. I want to say this really. Sometimes I feel like we need to give ourselves permission to be able to say that we're concerned about issues that are domestic focused. I think sometimes Muslims feel like we don't have the backing of our own organizational institutions who take on these type issues. So one thing that I would say really is, as we engage with our national representative organizations, and I'll say first and foremost, my organization, Islamic Relief, demand of us to take on these kitchen table issues that impact Muslim Americans. And I just want to reiterate, again, no matter how egregious it is for issues around immigration, issues of being profiled at the airport, but I will say this, and I've said this in many forms, there are more Muslim Americans in America who go food secure, who go hungry every day, than who will ever be racially profiled at the airport. There's an underlying assumption that most Muslim Americans even have enough money to even buy an airplane ticket to be at the airport. So there's a class dynamic we need to be real about here in the Muslim American community. Poverty is not an issue of being ashamed about. What's shameful is if we are not responding to it as a community. Now, really, as I said before, Congress actually controls the purse. A lot of these cuts to programs that impact our communities writ large we can ameliorate some of the concern. And we've just seen just last week how Americans had what we heard resistance recess. Average Americans across the country engaged with their senators, with their representatives, while they were back home in committee meetings, demanding very much around the issue of ACA, Obamacare, saying, we're not going to take this. You're not going to take away my health care. It can't happen. And we've seen that there's already been some slight change of narrative from the Republican Party about, okay, yes, we are looking for a alternative. We're not going to repeal without a program all ready to go. And they're even now stumbling over each other to put forth something that could be even viable, which I don't believe can be that. Now, how do we as Muslim Americans align ourselves with such activities and such proven facts or methods that have actually been part of the African American experience already? Using the protest, using public engagement to really put pressure on Congress. I would say this, what I would hope to believe is in 6 weeks is the next congressional recess.
That's right.
Everyone can go to Kevin McCarthy. He's the leader of the Republican Party in the House of Representatives. Go to Kevin McCarthy's website and you'll see a little tab that says calendar. You click on calendar, you can see when the different times where members of Congress are back in their districts. Muslim Americans need to start engaging. We can, as Islamic centers, Mosh is saying, we want to hold a public forum with our representative.
That's right.
And if you need the tools, the resources, skills, how to actually put that on and how to really engage, we've seen, again, this movement over the past few weeks is the Indivisible movement. Again, www.indivisibleguide.com, or you can type in Indivisible Guide, provides a lot of rich tools and resources for the average American that Muslim Americans can use in their own communities on how to engage, apply that pressure on the Republican Party on issues that really affect you. Make the personal political. What are you facing in your day-to-day life, and raise those issues with them? Living in poverty, food security, poor education. And, I would say what's also really important, thinking long-term. This is not about, and I think Sister Jamia brought this up, this is not really just about Donald Trump and this Congress. This is thinking long-term, building political power in our communities, Muslim Americans, and the larger context of which the communities we live in. Thinking about how do we get now the Muslim American community back in community organizing. Again, a small little fact. PICO, which is one of the nation's largest community organizing organizations that does training for community organizing, has stated that not even 1% of their congressional base is made up of Muslim Americans or mosques. Now, I think this is a real issue as we look about how do we gain power, develop power.
My mosque's not in it.
That's right.
I want you to know.
Dr. Hidris in that.
We in it to win it.
So how do we reclaim very much the African American narrative, the Muslim American narrative, in building political power? Again, it takes just you as an individual who's inclined, who's driven, who's interested to reach out to groups like the Industrial Areas Foundation. Man, go buy Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky.
That's right.
To start thinking about Marshall Gans, about community organizing. And I'm sure there's some way we can post up on Sapelo Square some resources and links about community organizing, how you want to get your mosque, your community network, your Muslim network trained and connected to other churches, synagogues, and organizations that are about building political power at the local level. And that also eventually lead up to organizing at the national level.
If I can chime in, the issue of saying right now, while people are fired up with their discontent, that politics is not what happens when you vote. That's not where politics ends. That's where your politics begins. That as soon as somebody gets elected to office, the next thing that your community wants to do, and in Congress, and they're in election mode all the time. Because in the U.S. House of Representatives, they have to be elected every 2 years. They have to go before the people every 2 years. If our community called them to account, said that this is our community's agenda, both statewide, locally, and those we send to Washington, we have a different reality. And those are individuals, by the way, because when you have a sleeping electorate, then you can take them for granted. The corporations and the others and other activist groups will seize the hour. Some people said, stay woke. It's time to stay woke, because right now is the greatest time to shake up the House of Representatives, without a doubt. And there are many people, and I'm telling you now, there are many people on some of these town hall meetings that are happening now. I know that many of us are thinking, oh, somebody was a Trump supporter, and they're an evil person. Many of those people now realizing the benefits that they have from the ACA, and now is the time to reach out to them and be their ally against their rotten elected official who is jamming them. You just need, and even though we may disagree about other issues, but around the issues that are the bread and butter issues of my neighborhood, you'll find allies in places that you never thought you had.
So I would like to say one last point on this. If we really, for a lot of people, no matter what your economic class and what you're faced with, it is to the point almost, I would say, of a religious obligation that we engage. And I'll say from this frame, I would say all Muslims are called to give their zakat. And when we give zakat, we make a niyyah on what we hope to believe that money is going to go to, whether we give it to Islamic Relief or the mosque. We also got to remember, all Muslim Americans, you live in America, you're paying, everyone pays a mandatory secular zakat called your taxes. How many of us
secular zakat, like
zakat? And I guarantee you, most of us actually pay more of that secular zakat than we actually do when we give them the zakat at the mosque.
That's true.
When has we as a Muslim American ever called your representative as part of your secular niyyah, asking them, I like to believe that my taxes are going to programs that empower communities instead of buying some $20 billion airplane. So that is the point. It is a religious obligation because of that secular zakat. You need to make a niyyah by engaging your member of Congress.
So I'm looking at some of the things that have been said so far. So we have Nisreen was talking about sort of the supporting some of these organizations like the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, African Communities Together, sort of these organizations that are sort of specifically sort of working around, and they're stretched thin, but one of the things we can do is kind of support these organizations that are working specifically around issues that face sort of Black immigrants, Black undocumented people who are Muslim and otherwise, right? Then we're talking about sort of, and you were saying also, Jihad, that we need to go to the Muslim organizations that do exist and then make demands. You call them these kitchen table issues, right? So not just issues around securitization and these things. Oh, there's Baji, right? Exactly. Yes, I think you're right. But also these kind of other issues like education, like healthcare, this sort of stuff. And then you also were saying, then, you know, you gave us some directions around visiting Congress, you know, when people are at home and visit them, and you talked about the indivisible guide that we can use as a way in community organizing, Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky. You also mentioned Industrial Areas Foundation, and I think even Johari, could you say a little bit about that? I think you're a part of that organization. Or?
Yeah, in Northern Virginia, Dar Hijra is a part of an alliance of interfaith groups that are under the national umbrella of the Industrial Areas Foundation. The same organization that trained Barack Obama in community organizing. I think Hillary Clinton, I think she did a little training with them. How to organize. And quite often, I mean, one of the big issues in terms of the methodology that we're using in IAF are not organizing around issues, but around power. So historically, we start a group that focuses on, we're going to get everybody together around affordable housing. And as soon as we win the affordable housing thing, the alliance falls apart. The idea in an organization like Voice, Virginians Organized for Interfaith Community Engagement, that's our local IAF organization. Jihad, I was one of the founding groups in Washington called WIN, Washington Interfaith Network. Baltimore's called BUILD. In Montgomery County, it's called AIM, but all using the same methodology for organizing our communities. To build what? Power. Power. Not to build relationships, politicians pat you on the back, and it doesn't matter whether they're Republican or a Democrat. Once you understand the nature of how to build power, that then changes everything. I use that power to get affordable housing. We use it to get better dental care in our community. We used it to pressure the police department to look into safe gun technology and sensitivity training. When you have power, you can unleash it on whatever you need to. But it's building, and not just power within my own masjid or among the group of masajid, but then churches and synagogues, and then to pull those together into a national network that can work on issues from the bottom up, not from the top down.
All right, thank you. Now, so Jameen, I want to bring you in now, because I was thinking about what you were talking about in terms of social media and this question of messaging and controlling the message. But oftentimes people talk about social media like an echo chamber, right? That you're kind of just talking to the same people. So I was wondering what are some steps we can do to kind of break out of that, you know, sort of that echo chamber sort of perspective of social media. How do we bring those messages, maybe even offline, you know, like how do we get kind of a conversation that's broader than, you know, your 2,000 followers, you know, on Facebook or Twitter or something like that?
Sure. So I encourage people to not just follow other Muslims. I have a group of progressive Muslims, but I also look towards other folks that I follow on social media, folks, particularly in this light of not quite knowing what is true in the news. I also, you know, and I think this kind of relates to what you're talking about. I want to talk a little bit about trolls. All of us as Muslims on social media, which is a public space, have to deal with trolls. And I want to encourage everyone to not interact with them. But if you choose to interact with someone who is dissenting. They're disagreeing with you in a respectful way. That's the only way I would interact with someone. Remember our deen, remember who we are as Muslims, and don't go to their level. Engage with them respectfully. I've done that with a number of folks. I was working on a project with PBS around trying to get supporters of different Republican candidates. And so I got a lot of trolls, and I interacted with them respectfully. And some of them I was able to gain as supporters. And I agree with Imam Johari when we're talking about, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, we have to look for commonality, particularly in this light. And, as we saw with resistance, with Resistance Address recess last week, Move On was one of the organizers around that as well, is that people understand that the things that make their lives easier, they want to keep and retain. And some of these folks voted for Donald Trump. And we have to remember that some of the folks who voted for Donald Trump also voted for Barack Obama. There are many people in this country who are suffering. And sometimes what they do is not motivated by racism, but motivated by their economic parity and the fact of what Brother Jihad was talking about, the fact that they are trying to survive and keep a roof over their heads and whatnot. And so they are thinking this is what they're going to do. But I totally believe in not just remaining in an echo chamber and talking to your folks that you went to high school with and you went to junior high school with, even if they aren't Muslim, even if they are Republicans and do not agree with you whatsoever. Engage with them, because it's important for us, particularly in this political climate, to understand what the opposition is and where people are coming from. And it makes you a better communicator, it makes you a better bearer of the message in our issues and stories that our communities need to tell. We can be an insular community to a degree. I grew up in a Muslim family and we didn't participate in anything. We didn't vote, we didn't do anything. And it's important that we engage with each other and we tell our stories and we let people know who we are so that they understand who Muslims are and what our concerns are, because they're very similar to the concerns of many American families.
Thank you. I think we have a question from the audience that I'll ask and kind of make it broader, and then we'll move to sort of closing remarks and sort of action steps. So look, one of the questions we had from the audience was specifically actually to Imam Johari, was asking him could he be more specific around, I think, this question of building relationships between Black Muslims and the broader Black community. But I wanted to kind of broaden that out to everyone to kind of speak to that, both in terms of Black Muslims and broader Black community relationships, and also in relationship to what Nasreen was talking about in terms of relationships between sort of kind of US born sort of Blacks and sort of Black immigrants or second, third generation Americans, right? Who have a kind of immigrant background. So what are some specific things we can do around strengthening those relationships between those different kind of Black constituencies?
One of the things that I think is critical in this time, Stokely Carmichael reminded us that we're not poor, we're just poorly organized. That the issue is getting organized. In our work around community power, rather than going individual by individual, we look at building bridges with institutions. So you look at the institutions within a community, and then you make your outreach there. So if I'm in a community there, African Americans, I was at a place called ECDC the other day, Ethiopian Community Development Center, working with them, saying that we may have come on different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. That relationship, just going and visiting their institution and supporting the effort that they're having going on, brings them now to a sense, Imam, I need to talk to you later. We need to find ways that we can work together to share resources to become our allies in the struggle for establishing justice. So in the same way, you might live in an area. Do you know where the NAACP is? Where's the local NAACP chapter? Right? If you're talking about economic development, is there an urban league chapter? To reach, these are entities that are organized, they meet regularly, they have infrastructure, and you begin to bring the infrastructure that you're related to into that network. and then from there you can build power together. Is that granular enough?
I think that's very specific, and I think that is kind of, I'm imagining what the questioner was asking. I wanted to bring Nasreen in, although she looks frozen to me, so I'm not sure. Yes. Does she look?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I think I guess I want to echo what Imam Johari said. I also think, though, on the flip side, that again, like I mentioned this earlier, I think our communities have a lot of work to do in terms of, the way we've positioned ourselves on the hierarchies that white supremacy has created in this country, and a lot of folks in our communities who are confused even about whether or not they're Black. So there's I think there's work on that level that needs to be done. I think that can then help us build coalition better and do better solidarity work. Just even the basic of Black Muslim immigrant lives are not going to matter until Black lives matter in this country. And so just that kind of, and specifically, I as I mentioned earlier, I think going to the community-based Black immigrant-led organizations that are doing the grassroots organizing work and figuring out how we can all work together to leverage resources together to coalition build, I think that's really where it's at.
That's great. Yeah, I think this idea. So what I hear both of you saying is, one, that there are institutions that already exist in these communities that are opportunities for us to kind of build relationships, right, with each other. And so there's that kind of work, building relationships and building power, but also this kind of there's a level of consciousness raising that has to happen as well, right? So both in terms of the ways in which I think Nasreen is speaking about the ways in which sort of Black immigrant communities, right, in terms of, I guess, these hierarchies of white supremacy sort of may see themselves as better than maybe, right, than US born Blacks. But then also the ways, I think, speaking from a different perspective, I think we could talk about the ways in which sort of US born sort of African Americans or Black Muslims or Black people in general sort of may not always kind of recognize sort of the special circumstances that immigrants are facing too, right? Or even the ways in which immigrants have shaped what it means to be Black in this country, And I say this, of course, because my family background is from the Caribbean, Latin America, and it's like, Malcolm's grandmother was from Grenada, and so there's a way in which, you told Minister Louis Farrakhan, his family's from the West Indies. So there's also this way in which we have to recognize, and I think going even back to the early part of the conversation, when Imam Johari was talking about Pan-Africanism, right? And this kind of thinking of ourselves and thinking of our Blackness as broader than, right, just the specific realities we face in whatever country we ended up in, in that kind of way. So I want to kind of bring us to a close tonight because we're kind of running out of time. Lots of great suggestions. So what we're going to do at Sapelo is we're going to kind of pull these together. We're asking you guys for links so we can kind of create something. We can share that information. We can use social media, right, in the ways that Sister Jamia was suggesting to sort of share this information and really propel people to really sort of get involved and get active. But so I want to close by just asking people, sort of a 2-minute sort of closing statement. What do you want to leave the audience with? And also, one suggested action. You might repeat something you already said, or it might be something new. And I like us to start the other way around. So we end it with Sister Jamia. So we'll start with you, and then we'll work our way back.
Sure. So one of the things that you asked me that I didn't quite answer, and I'm just gonna speak a little bit about now, is what actionable items that we can do to bring our online conversations to offline. And I believe, what Sister Nasreen and Imam Johari were saying about joining organizations and being a part of existing organizations, because whether they are Muslim organizations or not, our voice is necessary. And these are membership organizations, so we can bring our voice in that sense. There are Muslim organizations like Empower, empower.org, that's Empower. There's organizations like, the NAACP that have been around for years. There's organizations like CARE and ADC, and other organizations that have been mentioned already. The Urban League and local chapters and local branches of these civil rights organizations. I think that we also have to tell our stories. Use the tools that we have. We're using Google Hangout tonight. Anyone can tell a story and put on a podcast. Using Facebook Live, anyone can use their phone and broadcast a message, telling their story, sharing their story, interviewing their friend, interviewing family members, community members, and speaking to them. And then I think it's also important for us to be intersectional and to support our brothers and sisters who are immigrants, who are refugees, who are being deported, to rail against and resist against this ridiculous proposal of a wall that's going to be built on the southern border. We don't need anything like that. This is a country of immigrants. And although not all of us are from immigrant communities, I believe that our immigrant and our immigrant background and that diversity is what strengthens this country and what could make this country better than it could be. The future of making this country great it's in our future. It's not in our past, and our diversity makes us strong. And it's important for us as Black people, as people of color, as people from all over the world, to recognize our struggle and recognize our stories and tell those stories and support those stories with a perspective of people of color and negating white supremacy and racism. Thank you.
Let's go to Aisha. She had technical difficulties, so we'll have to kind of hear from her another time. So let's go to Jihad, your closing remarks, and then Imam Johari after Jihad. You're muted, Jihad. You're muted.
I want to thank you again for hosting this and bringing us all together and sharing. I've actually learned a lot just from our discussion too. But I want to actually add something to, I think Sister Jamil was bringing up about let's not use the terms of the oppressor or how communities frame. One thing I'm consistently always pushing back on is the decoupling of the Muslim community and the African American Muslim community. There's a consistent use of the Muslim, Arab, South Asian community. Compromise the Muslim community. They'll say, yes, the Muslim community is joining the community to do equity. And I had to step back and be like, wait, I didn't know there was a difference between the two. It creates, when we do that internally, it creates a situation where we feel like when we're engaging on Black issues, it is an act of charity, or we're exerting ourselves beyond what we could actually need to be focusing on. We need to exert into Muslim. Really, that has to be done. And at an individual level, where we send it in the media, and then also how other public discourses, how we need to stop that, really. Places to resist, to disrupt, build coalitions. I think that's what we're really driving at this time. Building power is at base. I'm optimistic at it. I believe in that we can do it. It's been a part of our tradition, and we will continue to be driving this issue. And really, when we have to remember building coalitions is important is also because for that are maybe clearly distinct out of ours. There's been a whole lot of Muslim love going on lately. I love seeing.
Oh, that's right.
We're seeing it at airports. We're seeing people pushing back people of different communities.
That's right.
But again, whether it be white, Latino, LGBT, other faith communities coming to protect
That's
Muslim Americans. This is how do we continue to build on this?
Yes, sir.
And how do we, again, coalitions? We need to basically make sure that we understand issues are not mutually exclusive, the intersectionality, because a lot of people are catching hell right now under this administration and will continue to do so. Mm-hmm. And if we don't really think about how on issues that specifically impact our communities, but we can't always assume out of a moral obligation, other organizations, other communities will be able to come to our aid. And how do we protect that unity is showing interest in others and identifying how actually their issues actually are embedded already in the Muslim American community. So I just want to end by saying, first and foremost, as Muslims, the weapon of, yes, I also the weapon of the believer is dua. We all need to pray. We all need to make supplication. And I will say that let us pray and make good decisions, but also pray if and when they are not moral in their positions. Let's pray that the bureaucracy slows it down and stops it. Let's pray for the strengths of our organizations to resist, disrupt, and create a radical imagination of how we can create a better world.
I like that radical imagination. If I could say this, slavery did not end in America. People got tired of working for free. It ended because white people and Jews and others joined together, Native Americans, and all worked together to dismantle the system of enslavement. And that didn't necessarily people in their interest because it was good business for them. With that, I want to remind you of something that former South African Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool last week. On the train of coalition building, the people on the train with you, but they're not looking to get off at the same destination that you're looking at. LGBTQ people, right? They're destined there, but somebody else who's interested in getting driver's licenses for people who are undocumented, they're gonna go the rest of the way with them. But if we can get on the train moving toward justice together, that train with blacks, with new immigrants, with Muslims, and we may start having a dialogue and finding out what it is that we have in common around the issue of justice. It may be at the end that we don't wind up staying on the train together. But if we get further toward the end of the line for justice, it makes it better for everyone. But I said, because there are a lot of times we don't want to go into alliance with groups that at the end, the Muslim wants everyone to be Muslim. The Jew is interested in Jewish issues. The transgender is interested in. Between now and the destination point, we have a lot in common. So, bidnillah, let us work together. And Allah reminds us in the Quran, yuriduna an yutfi nur Allah bi afwahihim. Enemies of truth will try to extinguish the light of God with their mouths. First, his light will be, no matter how much the disinformation campaign, the division, the racism happens, that God Almighty is going to bring about the enlightenment. So for me, as soon as I see the talk like this, I know that the light is coming.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Nasreen, we're going to have you give our last closing remarks and action.
A lot of pressure.
I know, right? After that. Well, I have faith in you. You can do it.
So I think one thing I wanted to say is that I work with youth. I'm teaching in a 9th grade classroom right now, and I think I'm concerned about how we think about arming our youth, I guess, with history and with just supporting their strength and their ability to engage and organize as well. So I think, for example, I was just at a teach-in with a Japanese American man who was detained when he was 8 years old for 2 years in the 1940s. And after I spoke, he took my hand and he said, I want you to remember not to internalize the things they're saying about you, the things they're saying about Muslims, they're saying about Black people, because it took me a lifetime to undo that. And so I think that message is an important one in the way that we think about how history can be so powerful in uniting our communities and making people feel empowered. You, Saad, were talking about you know, I like think to me this what you said reminded me of the fact that, for example, Malcolm X's imam was from Sudan, and how even just that point can, you know, make a young Sudanese you know, kid feel empowered and connected in a way that you know, history allows us to do that. So to me, that's one thing. I think the other thing is just to recognize that as Black folks, you know, there's so many people in our communities who, as I mentioned, are undocumented and are affected by the Muslim ban, and are affected by a host of all kinds of other orders and things that are happening, and that we can't afford to then decouple these assaults on our communities. Like everybody else has said, we have to join in our analysis and in our organizing, really think about just how these issues are intersecting, and how then our organizing strategies have to be targeted in that kind of way.
Thank you for that. That's fantastic. I mean, that's a lovely way to end. I think this idea of history, one of the reasons why we do what we do, for example, with Sapelo Square, is precisely one of those things. We have, of course, we have a history section, but we're also very much interested in, right, you know, sort of, and going back to what Sister Jamia said, like sort of amplifying stories, telling our own stories, because it does empower you, right? I like what you said about this kind of having an intersectionality in our analyzing, in our organizing practice, right, and kind of bringing that together. And I think that's a really key. That's a great way to end our conversation tonight, and something for us to kind of keep us moving forward. Again, I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Imam Johari. I want to thank Imam Johari Abdul Malik. I want to thank Nisreen El Amin, Jihad Saleh, Aisha Prime, and Jamia Adams for participating in this panel tonight. Where do we go from here? Action steps. We're going to do our best to be quick about sort of listing, getting all the different things we said tonight, sort of in a platform that's easy for folks to get into access, so that people can, you know, like I said, like Red Ben said, it's time for some action, right? So we want to give everybody the chance to really sort of get involved quickly. And, you know, and we'll continue the conversation. So thank you, the panelists, and thank everyone for watching, and assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Sawad.
Thank you, Suwan.
Thank you.